Thank you. I'm very honored, very excited to be here to see so many old friends and the opportunity to meet new friends. Thank you, Linga, for your very eloquent words, getting us sort of situated. And thank you to the organizers. We are, as we've already heard, intimated, we are faced with a great challenge today in the UK and in the US, I think even more than in other parts of the world, with this resurgent and very vocal strain of atheism, which is attacking the concept of God and the concept of religion. And we're faced with the challenge of coherently articulating a Baha'i position that in relation to this to these ideas. At the same time, though, we're also faced with the challenge to articulate Baha'i beliefs in a way that embraces the full range of religious diversity in the world. The message of the Baha'i faith is not just for those in the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. It's for people of the entire world. And although we may be comfortable and we may be more used to talking about the Baha'i faith, particularly when we talk about ideas of God, God's relationship to the world, the concept of a manifestation of God, we may be more comfortable formulating these ideas within a Judeo-Christian Islamic framework. But we have to keep in mind at the same time that the Baha'i faith is for the entire world, and that there's a whole Eastern tradition of religious thought, Far Eastern tradition of religious thought that I think we'll find has potentially a great deal to contribute to our ideas about God as well. A tradition of religious thinking with it which is not theistic necessarily. We find this quotation in the Quran, but also repeated in the Baha'i writings, that this is the tree which is neither of the East nor of the West. So how are we going to talk about Baha'i teachings with that idea in mind, that there are ideas embedded within the Baha'i writings that we may only be beginning to understand, ideas which may take us in directions that we don't expect, ideas that may lead us to saying things that we couldn't believe we would be saying. So I think our project, if I could propose our project this weekend, is partly to understand the nature of this conversation that's going on outside the Baha'i community, to understand better the arguments of the new atheists. But perhaps even more importantly, I think it's to understand more deeply the implications of the Baha'i writings themselves. There are such depths in the Baha'i writings that I think will contain answers to the arguments being put forward by the new atheists. And so part of it is understanding what they're saying, but what I want to spend more time on in my brief comments is focus a little bit more on bringing out some possible lines of approach from the perspective of the Baha'i writings. Because what we're doing is so new. What we're doing in the world is so new, not just what we're doing socially, how we're building up communities, how we're trying to sort of revolutionize societies from the ground up. But our very conception of what religion is different from the conception that most people have of religion. We're not one more religion competing for people's attention. The one common faith statement that was published by the House on behalf of the House of Justice a few years ago put it in such provocative terms when they said that Baha'u'llah has not come to bring one more religion to stand alongside the existing religions, but he has recast the very conception of religion as the principal force impelling the development of consciousness. So we're engaged in a fundamental redefinition of what religion is. And in the process of redefining what religion is, we will also, I think, find ourselves redefining some of the fundamental concepts that have defined what religion is. We'll be looking at what do we mean when we talk about God? What do we mean when we talk about revelation, religion, nature, soul, spirit, these words which we use on a day-to-day basis in our Baha'i lives, but which in the Baha'i writings we can find ways of understanding, thinking about, talking about these fundamental ideas which are maybe unexpected in certain ways. The Baha'i writings are often using these familiar words to express new concepts. So we can try to explore what some of these new concepts are. And in the process of exploring that, we may find that certain ideas that we had before will keep and other ideas we'll let go of. How much of what we now think is essential to Baha'i belief is really essential, and how much of it is not? How many of the ideas that we have are part of our collective childhood, and we'll set them aside and we'll move into a different way of thinking about things? So I think as we look at some of these ideas, a key to our approach will be very open, to be very open in our approach, not to see things in black and white, not to see things as one camp opposed to another camp, but to try to find the truth which is expressed in perspectives which we might have thought initially are completely irreconcilable with our own. And I think in this we can take Baha'u'llah himself as an example of this when he was asked by Manakji Sahib, a Zoroastrian believer, not a follower of Baha'u'llah, but asked Baha'u'llah questions that led to the revelation of a famous tablet which has been published and translated fairly recently in the Tabernacle of Unity, and we were already familiar with key paragraphs from Baha'u'llah's first response because they were translated by the Guardian in Gleanings, and they include some of Baha'u'llah's best known statements. But Manakji Sahib wasn't happy with this first response, which included this key statement: "Be anxiously concerned with the needs of the day ye live in, and center your deliberations on its exigencies and requirements," which was sort of the one-sentence answer to all of the 9 questions asked by Manakji Sahib. But he wasn't happy with that response, so he asked Baha'u'llah for further details. And Baha'u'llah responded, or on Baha'u'llah's behalf, a much longer tablet was revealed that quoted the entire text of the questions of Manakji Sahib and a more specific response. And one of these questions, and we're so lucky that this happened, we're so lucky that Manakji Sahib was not satisfied with his first response, because otherwise I'm sure we would never have gotten the text of the questions. And one of the questions that was asked of Baha'u'llah was, can be translated into modern terminology in the following way. He asked Baha'u'llah, what is the right way of thinking about the relationship between God and the world? And he gives Baha'u'llah 4 options. And basically the options are, is it pantheism, that everything is God? Is it theism, the idea that there is a God who created the world and periodically sends messengers? Is it deism, the idea that the world was maybe created by some sort of God, but we're not really concerned with, and that God isn't really concerned with the world today? Or is it atheism, that it's just cycles of growth and decay, it's just, there's really nothing beyond this physical world? And when the prophets of God have said this, and when they've only said it just to help control society, there's no deeper reality behind it. So this is the question that Baha'u'llah is asked. And what he's giving are these 4 main ways of thinking about God and God's relationship with the world. So what was Baha'u'llah's answer to it? We might think, well, he would have said, well, of course, theism is the right way of looking at it, and the others are the wrong way of looking at it. But that's not what he said. He said, he had a couple of different answers, actually. His first answer was, be anxiously concerned with the needs of the day in which you live, and center your deliberations on its exigencies and requirements. Almost implicitly saying, these sorts of metaphysical questions are not the important thing. The important thing is what the world needs today. But he goes on and gives it another answer. There's actually sort of 3 answers. The second answer is that this position of the theistic position, he said, is closer to, and he uses a special word here, takva, he said, is closer to piety, is closer to God-fearingness. As Shoghi Effendi often translated the word, it's closer to righteousness. But then his third answer comes right after that, and he says, but it's also possible to provide a justification for each of the other three schools, because everything in its own way reflects some aspect of the truth. So this is from Baha'u'llah himself, a very open sort of answer that doesn't shut the door to one or another perspective, but is very open and willing to see that there are aspects of reality to be found in perspectives that that we might really not have expected to find truth in. So it's with that sort of perspective that I think we can more fruitfully approach arguments made by these new atheist authors. So what should our stance be towards them? When we pick up the God delusion and read the God delusion, should we see this as a sort of an enemy, that needs to be fought? Should we see this way of thinking as a sickness from which we should find a cure? Is it a sort of a pathology? Or can we possibly see it rather as a natural phase in our collective intellectual and spiritual maturation? It's a phase that we are going to go through one way or another, and we'll end up on the other side of it one way or another. And when we end up on the other side of it, we'll find that we're keeping parts of it and we're throwing away parts of it. Looking at and having read these works, I can find much in it that I would want to keep, much in it that I would support wholeheartedly as a Baha'i. This uncompromising commitment towards discovering reality. This skepticism towards revealed truth, towards skepticism towards received truths, which comes actually, straight from the Kitab-i-Iqan. Part 1 of the Kitab-i-Iqan is all about don't believe what you're told. Investigate reality for yourself. This willingness to discard outworn ideas the moment they become outworn. Something that we can, that is firmly embedded in our own writings. This emphasis on proof and evidence over blind acceptance. A scientific attitude, which Shoghi Effendi says is one of the fundamental characteristics of our faith. It's scientific in its method. And overall, an optimism about the human condition, that we have the power, we have the ability to improve ourselves in our environment. These are all aspects of these books and this movement, if you want to call it, that I think we can wholeheartedly support. At the same time, there are aspects of it that we don't agree with. Aspects that if we see this as a phase that we're passing through, that we believe will grow out of a very narrow-minded materialism and a almost childish rejection of what can't be seen and touched. Abdu'l-Baha famously lampooned this position in his talks in the West. I think beginning with his talk at my alma mater at Stanford, where he compared the philosophers to the cow. He said, it's as though they're cows who go about happily, in their existence, believing and acting only on what they can eat, what they can see and touch. And he said that's sort of like these materialistic philosophers that just completely reject the possibility that things that can't be seen, things that can't be touched, things that can't measure, ultimately don't matter. There's, of course, as anyone who's read any of these works has noticed, there's a certain intemperance of tone. There's a certain trying to ridicule the other position. There's a certain taking the other side at its worst rather than taking it at its best. If you really want to be honest in an argument, you want to make your opponent sound as good as possible, and then you attack that position. You don't try to make your opponent seem as ridiculous as possible. That's setting up a straw man. And that's something they do very well. They set up all sorts of straw men, and then they knock them down. It's easy. But there's an astonishing ignorance of the subtleties of the positions that have been taken by religious people throughout the centuries. which one can always say, well, they're not dealing with these subtleties. They're not dealing with religion at its best, because what they're really trying to do is they're attacking what the majority believes. And it's true that the majority do not have a very nuanced picture of these ideas. But going back to this idea that perhaps this atheistic mindset is a phase that we're going through and not a pathology to combat, then at the end, when we come out at the other side, in certain ways we're going to be thinking differently than how we thought before. I'll submit that the way forward is not to somehow turn back the clock to a more innocent age. We can't hunker down and wait until the storm blows over. The genie of modernity is long since out of the bottle, and we're not going to be able to put it back in. We have to find ways of understanding our own writings that take into account changes in thinking that are not going to change back. And it's with this in mind that I think we could look at some of these perspectives on the nature of God in the Baha'i writings that may be helpful in our understanding, in our dialogue with the new atheists. The problem, the overall strategy, if one wants to try to boil down what the new atheists are saying, the overall strategy, one can say, is a sort of a two-pronged attack. On the one hand, they're attacking the idea of belief in God. Is it logical? Does it make sense? Is it perfectly ridiculous to believe in God? On the other hand, they're attacking religion as an institution. They're attacking, and we'll hear Mujan tell us more about this. The problem is that as one very, I think, insightful critic of the new atheist has said, the problem is that they reject a worthless caricature of the real thing. And their rejection is rooted in a degree of ignorance and prejudice to match that of religion's own followers. In other words, they're buying their rejection on the cheap. But at the same time, of course, what they're rejecting is what most people believe. And so one can always argue that from that perspective. Overall, their perspective on the existence of God and their treatment of the idea and the coherence of the existence of God can be perhaps boiled down to the idea that to them, as I think to most followers, to most religious believers in God, if you were to force them to the point, God is a hypothesis about the physical world. And since you can't use God to explain the physical, since science, the laws of physics, our understanding of nature has advanced to such a degree that you can no longer use the God of the gaps to explain things. It's no longer necessary to appeal to a God of the gaps to explain things. That they believe that such a God doesn't exist because we can now explain so much of the world around us. And thus, from that perspective, religion becomes, as this critic has said, his name is Terry Eagleton. I don't know how many people have heard of Terry Eagleton. Has anyone read anything by him? He says religion is a botched attempt then to explain the world. But he says that's sort of like seeing ballet as a botched attempt to run for a bus. They just don't get it. They don't understand what religion is trying to do. That if you see religion as some sort of alternative theory about how the physical world works, then of course it's not going to hold up to rational scrutiny. So, are we going to look at the arguments of the new atheists and try to counter them all by saying, well, you're saying God doesn't exist, well, you're wrong because of this and this and this, and we think God exists because of this and this and this? Are we going to try to bring back try to resurrect these traditional arguments for God's existence? I will suggest that might not be the most fruitful line of approach. I will suggest that perhaps the idea of God that's in the Baha'i writings is not the same God that the new atheists are attacking. And likewise, the religion that the Baha'is believe in, the religion that we represent, is not that same burned-out husk that the new atheists are attacking. Can we really blame them for attacking this burned-out husk? Can we blame them for seeing all of the terrible things that have been done in the name of religion? And can we blame them for not seeing those tiny green shoots that are coming up all over the world, but still it's more or less a barren wasteland when you look at the situation of religion in the world. And you really have to have a perceptive eye to see what's going on, to see those seeds that have been sown and that are growing, but haven't yet brought their fruits. So, don't we agree with them then on certain fundamental areas? Don't we agree with them that? Do we believe in the? Can we say that we don't believe in the God that they don't believe in? Can we say that we also don't believe in the religion that they're rejecting? If we're going to say that, we have to say, well, what exactly do we believe in? What is our position? And I just want to say a few things about that and then open it up to questions and discussion. I think this whole looking at their arguments and closing the book when I finished reading the God Delusion, I found myself asking, whose side am I on in this debate? Because it wasn't an obvious answer. Am I on his side, or am I on the side of the thing that he's attacking? And I concluded that both sides were wrong, and that almost equally wrong, really. And that what we need to articulate, and what I believed as a Baha'i, what I think needs to be articulated, is some sort of third way, some sort of other way of understanding. We'll start with the idea of God, which in the Baha'i writings, in most places, is quite recognizably a traditional theistic God. God as creator, God as possessor of all attributes, God as loving, compassionate, God as object of worship. But we also find in the Baha'i writings a large number of passages that talk about God in very different terms, that talk about God as excluding all known attributes, that talk about God as beyond, and if God is beyond all known attributes, well, isn't oneness a known attribute? Isn't existence itself an attribute of things? If God is beyond all attributes, isn't he then also beyond being one? If we think of what are the most fundamental things we can say about the deity, we'd say, well, it exists, and there's only one of him. You'd say, well, everyone can agree to that, right? But do we all agree to that? Is it true to say, really technically, and I don't want to split metaphysical hairs, but is it true to say that God exists and that there's one God? Can we all agree to that in this room, just among Baha'is? But if we agree to that, we might, it's almost automatic to say, well, of course, I mean, the three onennesses, this is what we all grew up believing. But to say that is already to assign two attributes to God, which we know perfectly well. We understand what it means to exist. We understand what it means to be one versus many. If God's essence actually excludes all attributes, then there actually is nothing that you can say about the deity. The moment you open your mouth, you are almost by definition saying something that's not true. Even to the extent of seeing God as object of our worship. Whatever attributes we assign to God, even to picture God as some reality which we worship, is something which, amazingly, in the Baha'i writings, this is actually in the writings of the Bab, he explicitly rejects that idea. This is in Gate of the Heart, Nader Sa'idi's book Gate of the Heart, which was translated, published a few years ago. He quotes a passage from the Bab's writings where he says this absolutely revolutionary thing. And when you stop and think about it, you realize how this turns on its head the way we normally think about our relationship to God. He said, if the worshiper worships God as the object of his worship and sees himself as the subject worshiping that object, then he is, in fact, never worshipped God and has joined partners with God. Because he's worshipped a figment of his own imagination. Any concept you set up in your mind, even if you try to exclude all the attributes, just worshipping God as object of worship, the Bab says, is a form of idolatry. What are we to make of those sorts of statements in light of the thousands of Baha'i prayers that have been revealed that say things like, "Thou hast created me to know thee and to worship thee"? This is our ground zero of Baha'i belief. How are we to take these sorts of statements, which take our relationship to God in a traditional theistic perspective, and how are we to understand that in light of statements like the Bab, saying that treating God as an object is a form of idolatry? Let's add to that Baha'u'llah's statement in Gleanings. I don't think it's an accident that Shoghi Effendi put this as section number 1 in Gleanings. I know this is one of Wendy's favorite. Baha'u'llah says that everything we have told you, this is a paraphrase obviously, everything that we've instructed you by way of worshiping God in his greatness, in his glory, in his power, in his majesty, he said, all of that is so that you come to a better and fuller understanding of that reality which lies within your own self. Somehow, this whole formulation Baha'u'llah is saying at the very outset, and the Guardian front-loads this in Gleanings, the whole formulation of God in this traditional theistic way as object of worship is actually with some other aim in mind. It's with a recognition of a reality which lies as much within us as it does beyond us. And actually to say it's just within us, I think would be going the opposite direction. It would be making the error in the other direction. Because God is neither within us nor without us. It's actually neither. That reality cannot be said to be either a subject or an object. It transcends the subject-object dichotomy. And I think we may find a little bit more insight in pushing this idea a little bit further in another statement by the Bab, where he says something about the nature of the soul relevant to this. And he says, as is so often the case, it's just one short sentence, but then you have to stop and really think about what he's saying. He says, the human soul is the divine self-description. He goes into it in more detail, and this is quoted in Gate of the Heart. We think of the soul as this unique possession of ourselves, different from other souls, different from everything else, different from God, certainly. But the Bab is saying something about the nature of the soul which explodes that distinction, that boundary between the soul, between the self and the other. And the boundary between the soul and God. He says, when he says that the soul is a mode of the divine self-description, it's basically, we are, in our inner essence, we are God's way of loving his own essence. And when we understand that, perhaps that comes somewhere close to the true meaning of fana, the true meaning of self-annihilation. The highest state, the mystical, the seventh of the seven valleys. Some sort of realization of this relativity of self and object. So I'm just touching on a few of these things because they illustrate, I think, certain depths in the Baha'i writings, which describe God, the soul, our relationship to God in ways that are not traditional theistic formulations. But what are we to make of that? That begs another question. So are our writings internally inconsistent? How do we describe this to non-Baha'is? How do we say, our idea of God is a little of this and a little of that, and in the end, we're not really sure. How do we articulate it in a way that makes sense, that doesn't seem wishy-washy, or that doesn't seem internally consistent? People wrote to Shoghi Effendi about this. There's various aspects in the Baha'i writings where it says this here, and then over here it says something which seems completely opposite. And this is one of those. And you could stack up a whole pair of these dichotomies in the Baha'i writings. And people asked Shoghi Effendi about these. And in several different letters, he expressed the same sort of idea. In one of them he said, and this is one of the quotations in the packets, he said, the the Baha'i writings are like a sphere. So there are points, poles apart, and in between are the thoughts and the doctrines that unite them. And I think this idea of a sphere can be one starting point in a conversation about this. It's almost like the moon. The moon, when it rotates around the Earth, only one side of the moon is visible to the Earth. We don't think about that often, but the moon is not rotating relative to the Earth. You only see one half of the moon. There's a whole dark side of the moon with a whole different set of craters and everything that we've never seen before. At least we never saw it until the first astronauts flew around the dark side of the moon and took pictures of it. But it's there. We know it's there. But on our day-to-day basis, we don't see that. And perhaps it's a similar sort of thing in the Baha'i writings. On a day-to-day basis, we see a very traditional theistic formulation of the concept of God in the Baha'i writings. But it's a three-dimensional concept. There's a whole dark side of the moon. There's a whole, it's not completely it's not a perfect analogy, but in terms of where the emphasis lies, there's other aspects of this reality, this higher dimensional reality. It's like the shadow of a cube that's cast on or the shadow of a drinking glass that's cast on a wall. And depending on how you orient the drinking glass, that shadow can look like a circle or it can look like a square or a rectangle. And without understanding that there's this three-dimensional object, if all you ever see is that shadow on the wall, you might not never connect the idea of a circle and a rectangle. You might never realize that circle and that rectangle actually describe the same reality. But since we only have access to the shadow on the wall and we don't have access to that three-dimensional object, we'll never, unless we somehow get the intuition to access that, we're never going to connect the circle and the rectangle. This idea, by the way, goes back about 2,500 years. Plato was the first to talk about this idea in the Republic. But I think that sort of idea can be helpful, that reality, particularly these matters of the spirit, are at the higher dimensionality than can fit into our two-dimensional brains. We can understand logical things really well, but spirit transcends logic. Spirit transcends Aristotle's law of the excluded middle. Something is either true or not true. Neither, not both, and not neither. That's a fundamental rule of logic upon which all logic is built. But spirit doesn't follow that rule. Quantum mechanics doesn't follow that rule either, and that I think, but we'll talk more about that tomorrow, about how some ideas from modern physics can possibly usefully connect to some of these profound ideas that we find implied in the Baha'i writings. So I think one of the implications of this is that to try to go down the path, just to close, to try to go down the path of defending a theistic position, pulling out the traditional arguments about God's existence, may not be the most useful path. It can be useful as a signpost. Abdu'l-Baha talks about proofs for the existence of God all the time, in Some Answered Questions, in his talks. But in Some Answered Questions, a few pages into Some Answered Questions, after giving one or two proofs, you know what he says? He says, I've given you these proofs for the weak-minded. He said the true proof is the eye of inner insight. And once that is open, 100,000 proofs become visible. The Bab goes even farther. And this is again in Gate of the Heart. So much of the neat tidbits of the Bab's writings are in Gate of the Heart. The Bab says, to try to prove God's existence, he said, is an unpardonable sin, inasmuch as that existence is beyond all proof. So the only proof of God's existence is God himself. There's no working your way to it by reason. And to do so is to try to put in a box something which can't be confined to a box. So I'll leave you with that thought that when we're thinking about and talking about God's existence in the Baha'i writings, we're thinking and talking about a reality which escapes the usual logical categories, which maybe there's a perspective with which we can think about it and talk about it logically, as Abdu'l-Baha often does in Some Answered Questions. But we have to understand that there's a context within that makes sense. And that's not a universal context. There are other contexts within which that way of thinking and talking about things doesn't make sense. So, I wasn't keeping track of time. Sorry if I've gone over.
No, not at all. Not at all. You've got more if you'd like to go on with it.
Maybe, what I was supposed to address, I didn't address the question, why do we need God? So why do we need God then? Baha'u'llah, I like Baha'u'llah's answer. We need God like the fish need the water of the ocean. And we're just like the fish in the water of the ocean. We depend utterly on the water. But if you were to ask a fish to point to where the water is, it can't. The water is part of the matrix of its life and its being. It's not in any particular direction from the fish's perspective. But nevertheless, it's there sustaining from moment to moment the fish's existence. I'm not saying that we're pantheists or that we're going in the direction of pantheism. This would take us in a little bit too abstract a level. But Abdu'l-Baha says that this idea of pantheism, this idea that God is the ocean and we're the waves on the ocean, and so that our fundamental substance is God. He said that's actually true, but not in relation to the substance of God. He said it's true in relation to the primal will of God. He said the ocean is the ocean of the primal will, and all the contingent waves and forms are waves and forms on the ocean of the primal will. Okay, how does this answer the question? So now we have to ask, well, what is the primal will then? And what's the relationship of the primal will to God? Are we just multiplying these abstract entities, solving one problem, but then opening up another problem? Maybe this can be a topic for a workshop, but just to really end with an idea of how we might try to resolve this apparent paradox between this transcendent God and this immanent God. We have the concept of the manifestation of God in the Baha'i writings, the concept of the manifestation of God, and the twin stations of the manifestation. Again, going back to the Kitab-i-Yagan as a sort of foundation for so much of our thinking. The idea that, as we're all familiar, the metaphor of the mirror, something can be a physical object, and at the same time it can be reflecting some higher thing. And it's not a contradiction to say that something is a mirror and to say that something is the sun, and you're pointing at exactly the same thing when you're saying it. Perhaps it's those sorts of ideas which we're already familiar with in the Baha'i writings as they relate to the manifestation. Perhaps these can help us understand something about relating these different perspectives of God, the immanent and the transcendent God. Perhaps the Baha'i prayers, in addressing God, are really addressing the manifestation of God. When we say the short obligatory prayer, "Thou hast created me to know thee, to worship thee," perhaps we're addressing Baha'u'llah. That's the real object of our worship. When people actually get offended, to what direction should we pray in? He says you should pray, you should focus on the manifestation as the only tangible thing to which we could physically direct ourselves, both physically and inwardly, and mentally, and spiritually. They're the only thing that we have, the only link between us and the infinite, which we can't direct ourselves to in any meaningful way, as the Bab says. It's not a proper object of our worship, of our attention. But Baha'u'llah is as representative of that unseen reality. Of course, it's not that we worship Baha'u'llah as, we're worshiping that, as you all know, we're worshiping those attributes shining upon the surface of that mirror. So, but that's probably a good place to stop. It'll just be more and more sort of fragmented if I keep going. It already was. So thanks for your patience, and I hope to... Thank you
very much indeed for those highly stimulating opening comments. And we now have some time for 15 minutes or so of just a brief question and answer before we have a break and then we'll do the workshop. So please, if there are any initial questions.
Hi, I'm Sina Fasal. Thank you very much. Just one comment and one question. The comment is, I haven't seen the new translation of Malik-ji. This is my fault. But I remember the provisional translation in the 90s, early 90s. And one of the full answers answers that strikes me. I mean, you mentioned 3 answers to the questions, but it strikes me that there may also be a 4th answer, which is that you don't fight. It doesn't matter what you believe, just don't fight about it. And then that could also be an alternative to the 3. Can you sort of, it's a nice additional question.
Yes, it is, yeah.
Response to it.
Yeah.
The question is, in the critique of the new atheists, are there things that people have pointed out which are also not measurable, which have a huge impact, and which are sort of taken for granted? And I'm thinking...
Art.
Music, the crowd music, black holes, I don't know much about black holes. And the third thing, I mean, I don't know enough about it, is sort of consciousness. I mean, something that we take for granted but very difficult to measure. Do people draw on these things very much and say, look, we can't measure them, but we take it for granted?
You do see that. You do see that in responses. And I think art is a fantastic example, including music and painting. It's a fantastic, a very powerful example, and I think a powerful metaphor that can be used very effectively, because the most diehard atheists will still respond artistically to certain things. They'll still have a sense of being lifted up to some other place, through experience of art and music. And one can almost sort of see, from that perspective, then one can almost see the new atheist as being someone who says, well, I don't believe art exists. And how do you have an argument with someone about whether art exists or not? They say, well, I see the painting. It's just flecks of paint. Yeah, I hear the symphony, but it's just vibrations of sound by rubbing, catgut against horsehair. I mean, it's nothing more than that. And how can you prove that there's actually something more, that it's more than just flecks of paint on a canvas? You can't. There's no physical evidence. There's no measurement you can make. There's nothing about those flecks of paint on the canvas physically that make it more than flecks of paint. So if you want to argue to the new atheist, if you were to say, well, that's all that it is, you can't really say, well, you're wrong. Well, you can say you're wrong, but you're wrong from a different perspective. You're wrong only if you see with the sort of eye of an artist. If you see with the eye of the laboratory scientist, I don't want to knock laboratory scientists, but if you want to, being sort of one myself in a sense, but if not so much in the laboratory, but if you want to attack this idea that it's just flecks of paint, you have to show them true art. And maybe that's the sort of where you go with that, is that you can't prove God's existence by some theoretical paper that says this is why art exists. You have to show them a work of art. And when they see it and say, oh, that's art, now I understand. Because all I saw before was really bad art. And that's exactly the case with the new atheists. All they've seen is bad religion. And so how much can you blame them for saying it doesn't exist, it's all a sham? It's all complete nonsense. In that sense, I think the most eloquent and ultimately the most effective response is not going to be something that takes place in articles or books or reviews or whatever. It's going to be by doing what we're doing now in the Baha'i community, which is to demonstrate a community in action that builds itself on these principles and is actually doing things in the world that's transforming the world.
Yeah, just a thought. Talking about this question of belief, and everybody believes in something. And the resource material that I was looking at before we started talking, Julian Huxley was quoted about this growing awareness that everybody needs to believe. Everybody's almost hardwired to believe in something. Even by making a statement that I am an atheist, it's a statement of my belief. So my thought comes to mind, and it was a friend of ours who made this comment years ago in Canada, who said, how many people throughout the course of human history have died for their belief in atheism, and how many people have chosen to die for their belief in God in some way, shape, or form? Just as a random comment, atheism doesn't inspire people to sacrifice their lives, or doesn't appear to. But belief in God, whether you're Christian or whatever your persuasion is, there are many examples of people who say, I believe so strongly that I would rather give up this physical existence than give up my belief. But nobody ever seems to have done that for belief in nothing or belief in no God.
That's what Baha'u'llah says in the Kitab-i-Gan. He says, wish for death if you are men of truth. He says, we have assigned this verse as the touchstone of faith. And he talks about the willing sacrifice of the lives of the followers of the Bab as being one of the great proofs of the Bab's revelation. If you're willing to give everything for it. And then he says, how can you, and Baha'u'llah goes further, he says, how can you take the words of these people, he's referring to the divines of the age, who do nothing but pursue their own, the aims of their own sordid life, who he goes on and describes them very, very vividly. And he says, how can you take what they're saying and over those who have sacrificed their life and their all for this faith? That also obviously speaks eloquently about the truth of something. But then you could always reply and say, what about all those people who are giving their lives for their faith in the wrong way? The suicide bombers. So giving of one's own life by itself is not a sufficient proof of the truth of what one's doing. One has to explore that further.
Wendy.
Thank you. You started off by talking about science, religion, and need for evidence.
Mm-hmm.
And then you went on to talk about flakes of paint. And the preliminary discussion we were having over here, the whole concept of evidence seems to me to be a challenging one. I mean, the usual thing I think the Baha'i say, and I certainly do, is around, well, the table can't know the carpenter.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't have the skill set to understand that. So the evidence that the table might have for its existence, or the fish or the sea, is that it simply doesn't have that set, and therefore, by comparison, we simply don't have the skill set that would enable us to have evidence of God in ways that are compelling for people who don't have that skill set or don't have that vision.
Yeah.
Which will only take you so far, but so I'd be interested, if you could perhaps elaborate on that, and also the kinds of, I mean, for me, when I was a child, or a young teenager, the Baha'i youth at that time, who were similarly challenged by these concepts, sort of hit on the idea that, in fact, very similar to what you said, the concept of God in the Baha'i teachings is secondary to an understanding of the manifestation of God, or whatever else you want to call that. And that, in fact, you could pretty happily be a Baha'i without actually ever coming to a conclusion about the nature of God being unknowable. And so that anything you say about God, by its very, even the word, is in itself a defining, which is in fact kind of a blasphemy, if you like.
Yeah.
So, in a sense, the Baha'is are, I'm just interested in your comments on that.
That's like Baha'u'llah saying, in answer to these theoretical questions, be anxiously concerned with the needs of the day in which you live. It's almost as though the action, the doing, is ultimately our center of gravity. Our center of gravity is not these theological questions, because we can't wrap our heads around it all. It's a multifaceted thing. We can try to articulate some sort of coherent theory about that can include this idea of God and that idea of God. Mujan is written about this. He has an article, The God of Baha'u'llah, which he goes through. Maybe he can tell us more about it himself, but it sort of breaks down these different ideas about God throughout the ages. We're never going to sort of wrap our head around it. And so in a sense, these theoretical questions, these metaphysical questions are secondary to what we're doing in the world. And that also is I think, an answer to your first question, that is, when it comes to proof, I don't think we can bring forward we're going to discover some way of getting at God logically that brilliant minds throughout the centuries and millennia have not found. I don't think we're going to find some new twist on this or that, the cosmological argument or the ontological argument or the teleological argument. I don't think we're going to find some new twist that's going to get us there. And if we did, what sort of God would we be proving? What sort of world would it be if one could actually mathematically prove God's existence? Just sort of taking the idea further, what happens to free will? What happens to morality? What happens to the purpose of existence? again, I always go back to the Kitab Igam. Baha'u'llah talks about what is the purpose of life, and what is the purpose of God testing us with things we don't understand. Why say all these things which are so hard to understand? Why challenge us in so many ways? Why say things that we don't expect and don't want to hear? So the purpose is so that the roses can be distinguished from the thorns. That the pure in heart can be distinguished from those who are not pure in heart. There's some purpose of creation that is not served by making it all a mathematically precise thing. Which then begs the question, well then what's the proof that we're offering? And we go back to the proof of transformation. Ultimately the proof, I think, the proof is showing them the art. The proof is playing the symphony. The proof is being the community that we're supposed to be. And and the rest will take care of itself. I'm not saying we should not have this conversation then. Obviously, there's a point to having this sort of conversation and to talk about how we're going to engage in the dialogue. But ultimately, I think where the real action is happening and where the real proof is being formulated and taking place is all over the Baha'i world, in all the regions, the localities where we're actually changing people's lives.
Yeah, the lived religion.
The lived religion.
Ishmael and Jason and Elisa.
Thank you. I so enjoy this, and I so resonate with it. I mean, I'm a fifth-generation atheist myself, and I think that actually Baha'is are functional atheists. That's what I think, because any God we can describe, we don't believe in. Any God we can conceptualize, we don't believe in. And there's a wonderful aphorism I wanted to share, partly because it's fun, but I think also because it actually captures a really good answer. And it's Abdul Baha citing Ali, the Imam Ali, on this issue. And he says, whoever asks concerning the unity of God, the divine unity, is ignorant. And whoever answers is an idolater. Whoever has acknowledged this unity is a heretic, and whoever has not acknowledged it is an unbeliever. And it seems to me that actually we do have a fairly coherent proof, but it's not a proof of God. I think our actual root of our belief is our belief in Baha'u'llah. And our belief in Baha'u'llah is not based on a metaphysical thing, it's based on a human being who was born, who was a human just like us. We confront on the same basis as we confront each other, and we find a perfection that exceeds one another. And that generates trust. And I think our belief in God is actually epistemologically an act of trust in a higher knowledge that we become persuaded in through a rigorous approach. And my thought is that in science is not that dissimilar. That most of the scientific beliefs we carry, even the most eminent scientists, have not been individually proven. You take for granted what other scientists have done, so you can ask new questions. And you take for granted that on the basis of believing the nature of their thought process and the evidence they have adduced. And I think similarly, we come to religion and we look at the founders of religion and we question them. And once we become persuaded that their insight exceeds the average insight on matters of religion, then you take on trust some of the things that you cannot prove. And in relation to the why we need God, I think Baha'u'llah says that the purpose of the knowledge of God is the knowledge of our own selves. So it seems to me that maybe when we extend the notion of attributes, which are human attributes, to infinity, we actually reveal our own potential. When we pray to God, Thou art the all-loving, we gain a concept of love that goes way beyond the love that we might experience from one another. And that gives us a purpose. But ultimately, God Himself, or itself, is like that. If you believe in Him, you're a heretic. And if you don't believe in Him, you're an unbeliever. That's a great quote.
That's great.
Yeah. One of my favourite stories about proof of the existence of God is the story of, I think it's Euler, who was asked, who was
On the plus.
yes,
Yeah.
He was in the court of Catherine the Great, was it? And Catherine the Great was the Tsarina of Russia, and there was a prominent atheist. Laplace was his name.
Oh, you go ahead.
I might have
Jump in with that.
remembering this one. But anyway, prominent atheist is wondering, comes to the Russian court, and Catherine the Great wants to basically get rid of him. Doesn't like his arguments or his attempting to disprove God. So she calls Euler up and says, please engage him in a debate and get rid of him. And so they set up this debate between Euler and this atheist. And Euler's known to be a great mathematician, so he's called to stand up. He just stands up and he gives out this mathematical formula. He says something like E to the power A equals B or something like that. Therefore, God exists. And he sits down, and the atheist is just what? And he expecting that Euler knows mathematics very well, just says, gives up and just wanders off because he can't defeat this mathematical argument. Now the point of it was that the mathematical proof of God was complete nonsense. The letters didn't mean anything. But so this sort of leads me on to my question, which is that the way Euler formulated the debate was he formulated in such terms that it couldn't be, he couldn't lose because it was just leading someone down a completely nonsensical, incorrect path, which didn't work. And I suppose my question with this is the question, why do we need God? Especially when we can't define God, suggests to me a debate that can't be won and will be fruitless. And I was just wondering how is the correct response to the question from an atheist, why do we need God? Is the correct response to just try and completely change the terms of the debate? Or deny the question, as it were?
I think we need God, well, in the sense that the fish needs the water, in the sense that the flower needs the sun. I mean, you could have an infinite number of analogies. We need God in the sense that we believe that it's just a part of the fiber of our being that we thirst for transcendence. And this manifests itself in different ways in human society. Among them is this passion for the arts, and it doesn't all take place in identifiably religious ways, but this working out of this human thirst for transcendence, this thirst for coming into contact with something beyond something greater than itself and becoming a part of something larger is something which, this isn't a logical proof, but it's something which is hard to deny that it's there because it's so pervasively expressed in human life and in human culture. As with the existence of God, this question of do we need God, I think both of them escape rational proofs. I mean, I wouldn't try to get into some argument proving that we do or don't. And I think ultimately for both questions, the ultimate answer is just the showing the result rather than proving the result.
Just following on from that, I'm just wondering if there's some kind of position in between trying to prove the existence of God and sort of washing our hands of trying to do that. Some position in between where actually we can help people to understand better the possibility of the existence of God and trusting in their rationality. So, for example, if by not accepting that God created the world in 7 days, presenting that to a rational person, then that may bring them one step closer towards understanding God. And if we say, well, actually, we're not going to engage in any debate, we're just going to say, well, just look at our community, I think. Yeah.
I think we can follow our perfect exemplar in that. I mean, that's exactly what Abdu'l-Baha did. I mean, Abdu'l-Baha, gives all these arguments, but he's very upfront about the limitations of these arguments. So it's almost as there's an example of this comes from Taoism or Buddhism or something, the idea of the finger pointing at the moon. It's like all logic and all rational argumentation is like a finger pointing at the moon. Sure, it's gesturing in the right direction, but the distance between the tip of the finger and the moon is effectively infinite. The only way to bridge that gap between the tip of the finger and the moon is by some leap of intuition. The logic itself it gestures in the right direction. problem is people take the finger and they take the arm, and they just study the finger and the arm, and they forget the fact that it's actually pointing at the moon. This is sort of the problem of religion, is that people take the husk, and they forget the kernel. They take the outward observances and the doctrines and the dogmas, and they forget that they're enclosing this precious kernel. And then, as the centuries pass, or what's that? The Wonderland. How many people saw the Wonderland when they were in the play that's of the light and the lamp, and it's gradually encrusted with so much stuff until you can't see the light anymore. And then someone gets the bright idea of taking off the whole thing, and then the light is re-revealed. It's similar sort of a thing that too much focus on logic can distract us from the thing that the logic is indicating, from the direction that it's gesturing in. But the right amount of focus and the right way of seeing what it's doing, which I think Abdu'l-Baha strikes that balance. He talks about these things, these proofs for God's existence. He brings out many of the traditional arguments. You can find variations of the cosmological argument in Abdu'l-Baha's talks, the variations on the teleological argument. I haven't seen any ontological arguments in Abdu'l-Baha's talks or writings, but he brings them out. But at the same time, he says, the eye of insight is the true proof. So maybe that's the way to take it. I mean, there is a middle position, and that's that reason can suggest, but it can't get you all the way. One example, briefly, if there's time, although I hope to get into it in more detail tomorrow, is a lot of Baha'is, I think, and myself also, up to sort of recently, was really convinced by the design argument. Really, truly convinced. Either life itself in all its diversity and beauty and complexity, or the cosmos and the laws of physics in all their beauty and diversity and complexity. And the evolutionary biologists have done their job in cutting out the feet from the argument of the design argument as it relates to biology, by saying there are physical processes that can account over the course of time for the evolution of life on Earth. You don't have to appeal to some designer. You don't have to believe that life was designed. It's not necessary to believe that life was designed. Oh, but what about the universe? I mean, the laws of physics are so gorgeous. If you've studied Maxwell's equations, or if you've studied Einstein's field equations of general relativity, you're struck by the amazing beauty and ultimate simplicity of these ideas. And it's hard not to try to deduce from that the universe as a whole must be designed, because it exhibits these features of design. It also exhibits features of fine-tuning. If you look at the strength of the gravitational interaction, the electromagnetic force, the strong and weak nuclear forces, the strengths of these forces seem to be tuned exactly right so that life can exist. If the electromagnetic force was just a little bit stronger or weaker, 10 or 20% stronger or weaker, life would not exist. Carbon and heavier elements wouldn't form in the hearts of stars, previous generations of stars. The Earth couldn't exist, life couldn't exist. So you might look at all of this fine-tuning of the universe, as well as the beauty and symmetry of the laws of nature, and say, well, there's evidence for design. But you can just turn around and say, well, maybe there's an infinite number of universes, and we can't see them. And this infinite number of universes, these parallel universes in what's called the multiverse, is a very popular idea now in cosmology. Maybe this multiverse accounts for apparent design so that you don't need to invoke a designer anymore. Because there are untold trillions of universes out there, all with slightly different values of the electromagnetic force, slightly different strengths of this or that, slightly different mathematical equations that underlie the physical world. And we happen to be living in the universe that supports life, and that's exquisitely fine-tuned to permit the emergence of life. We happen to be in such a universe because if we weren't, we wouldn't be there. We wouldn't be here to ask the question. So it sort of takes care of the design argument by instead postulating an infinity of worlds. Now one might turn around then and say, well, this really violates another sacred principle of science, which is Occam's razor, which is that you do not multiply to infinity or unnecessarily the entities that you need to explain a given phenomenon. But it doesn't really necessarily violate Occam's principle, because the idea of there being a spectrum of things is not, I mean, metaphysically, to talk about there being a million universes rather than one universe is not, it's not a million different kinds of universes. It's actually one theory. It's one consistent theory that anything that can exist does exist. That's all you have to say. And from that, you get everything else. You still haven't explained existence itself. And I think but that's a different sort of argument than the design argument. But the design argument, to try to maybe zero in on the design argument as our sort of remaining bastion of proof or something, I don't think that design arguments are ultimately any more logically convincing than other arguments. We can still use them to, as Abdu'l-Baha uses the cosmological argument, for instance, to suggest that the idea, because it's compatible with God, the fine-tuning of our universe is compatible with a creator who lays out things as though it were a blueprint. But it's not logically necessary to conclude the existence of such a God. You can just turn around and say, well, there's an infinite number of universes. So whichever way you look at it, I think, these logical proofs ultimately have a limit. They can be useful, but they ultimately have a limit.
There were two final questions, I think, just myself and Linda, and then we'll break if you still want to.
Slightly short. We might not be able to answer it now, but maybe two questions that are fairly similar on my mind are about dealing with people. So there's a huge number of people out there who follow these concepts and either fit into the category of having the traditional view about God, or they're the atheist. And yet, what we're being told is that receptivity is defined really as people who are willing to engage in our community-building activities. So, what is the balance between trying to get someone to understand the concept of a God, which we don't understand, and getting them to be involved in the activities? How do we get them? Are we judging them as being unreceptive because they don't believe in God, they won't engage in a core activity? Why should they come and pray, for example, on the one hand? And on the other hand, we have a whole bunch of people who believe in God, but it's not the God we believe in. And our activities are perpetuating the non-nuanced version, even, and the God we pray to is one which ultimately the faith rejects.
I wouldn't say it rejects it. I would say that the faith doesn't ultimately reject it, but it sees that there's a bigger picture to it. That's a great question as to sort of our strategy today. I mean, if it turns out that the vast majority of people receptive to the faith are people who have no problem with a theistic picture of God, then why go through all the trouble of trying to engage this small minority of people who really could care less? It's a great question. I mean, and I don't think I have a great answer, except that ultimately this is a faith for the entire world. I mean, ultimately, although in a short term or even in the medium term, it makes sense strategically to look at what the receptive populations are and to focus efforts on those receptive populations. At the same time, we have to be aware that this umbrella of the faith has to extend over the entirety of mankind. Both people who will immediately, once they hear it, say, oh, this is already really close to what I believe, and then they come in very quickly, as well as people who may say, oh, I don't even believe in God and I'm not interested. They have to be included too, eventually. As well as the people in Thailand and Japan who say, I don't believe in God, but I do have a very spiritual perspective on human life and suffering and how we should be in the world, which ultimately can also be compatible, but we haven't yet found a way to describe the Baha'i faith in terms that's really going to appeal to a Taoist or a Buddhist, for instance. So, but in those countries, there'll be different workshops going on where people talk about it in those terms. But ultimately, we have to find a vision and a way of expressing ourselves that is not so narrowly targeted to an individual population, even if strategically or tactically, I would say, at a particular moment in time, we have to decide. Okay, we have 10 people available to go and do these community activities. What community are we going to try to do it in? That's a different sort of decision that has to be made, and that may be very different from the sort of thinking that we're engaging in this weekend, which is sort of more, I think more of sort of a long-term question about how are we positioning the Baha'i faith to ultimately embrace all of humanity.
Final question we have. Great. So I think we'll thank you very much indeed. That was a very, very engaging, stimulating, good kick-off to the day. So we'll have a brief break, about 15 minutes or so, and then come back into the workshop. Everyone's already been assigned into a workshop group, and their workshop facilitators, and Stephen, I think, will be circulating around the different workshops.
Is there a list? Sorry, Sam.
Yes, I was going to say, should we do that now in terms of dividing, or should we after the break?
Now.
Now. Good. So we have where's the list? There it is. 4 groups. So Salim will be facilitating one group, Fidelma, Sam at the back, and Ismail. So in Salim's group, from here we have Farneh, Tina, Nabil, and Claire will be going with Salim, and you'll be in the reception room. They'll be in the front reception room. Sam, in the orange jumper, will be taking Claire Paris, Jason Maud, Sina Fazel, Masa Javid, and Mitra Jalili will be going with Sam, orange jumper. Fidelma will be taking Wendy, Carl Whiteman, Annabelle Knight, Nahal Mava, John Paris will be going with Fidelma. And the last group will be going...
Sorry, where are we?
Sorry, you will be in the other side of the reception room bookshop end, if you like. And then the other 2 groups will be... Sam's group, will be here, and then the final group will be kind of in the corridor-ish area here. It's all very cosy. Final group is you. And you'll have Aryan, Dan, and the other 2 aren't here yet. Actually, but the other people Ed, sorry. Yes, there's Ed's name's there. And then the other people who joined that you can join
Pick a group.
Ishmael's group.
Okay.
No, you should join Ishmael's group because that's...
The first one was this, right?
Yeah, the first one can also take a couple.
No, I think the first one has...
Sure.
Yeah.
Many names have not been called.
Sorry, who's not? Yes, has anyone not been called out? Mujan will be circulating if he doesn't mind. Anyone missed out? Do we all know vaguely what we're doing? Good, okay, so we can now break for 15 minutes or so. And then we'll come back to the briefs.
It wasn't nearly as coherent as I hoped it would be. Yeah, it was fantastic. You recorded? Yes, I'm just trying to make sure you stop it correctly.
But you know in the greetings, one of the last